the cultural transition that's required to get everyone out of their cars into these alternative modes of transport will not occur by 2050. That is a much longer transition. I hope that it occurs this century, but I don't think that it's realistic to put all our eggs in that basket in order to hit the 2050 target. We need all the tools in the tool shed, and electrification of cars is a key lever within that. As a sector, as an industry, we have a responsibility to take a bit of a step back and have a little less infighting over, this or that, and understand it's actually all of the above. We can't make this shift without electrifying transport. Equally, we can't make this shift and have a fully sustainable transport system if we don't start to seriously look at how to give people a legitimate option to move away from using a private car and have other alternatives that are affordable, accessible, and obviously sustainable.
Perfect. Well, Jake, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today.
It's great to be with you, Emily.
My first question is always a bit of like an elevator pitch about yourself. So if you could go through your name, the organization you work for, and also something that you are passionate about.
Sure. So my name's Jake Whitehead, and I have a bit of a complicated work life where one job isn't ever enough. So my main role at the moment is as CEO of a company called Odenpass, which runs as a mobility as a service operator, selling subscriptions mainly up here in Queensland. And I'm also currently chief scientist at the Electric Vehicle Council, who I've been working for about 3 years now. I'm very fortunate to have both of these roles that are quite different, I guess, looking at other aspects of the transport sector, but are complementary in the sense that they're both working towards this overall overarching goal to decarbonize transport. And that's something that has, I think, driven me for a very long time. I've always been interested in sustainability more broadly. And when I started my career 15 or so years ago, looking at what avenue I could embark upon to help kind of fulfill that motivation, transport jumped out at me, and I've been involved in that ever since. Really looking at how we can eventually, hopefully, have a more sustainable transport system than we do today.
I am quite excited for this conversation because EV in general, but also now more broadly, I think decarbonisation, it kind of finally came over from Australia after a big conversation in the UK. So it's good to kind of finally have this conversation in more of an Australian context. Speaking of which, what policy changes or regulatory measures do you think are critical in Australia when it comes to accelerating the adoption of electric vehicles?
Yeah, so when we talk about electric vehicles, in particular light vehicles, which are the majority of emissions in the transport sector, Australia has been somewhat of a laggard, at least up until maybe two years ago, where we started to get a bit more proactive policy action happening. And whilst we haven't caught up, I would say, to the global average yet, we're heading in the right direction. The gaps to date have really been around getting the supply of vehicles into the country that are at the right price point, but also meet the needs of different Australian households and businesses. We are a big country, a diverse country, lots of different habits that and household structures. And so we need to have that broad range of vehicles to cater for people that are living in, outback, regional, remote parts of the country, as well as, more urban built up areas. Thankfully, we have recently had the federal government pass something called the New Vehicle Efficiency Standard, which Australia, was in the company of Russia in being one of the very few countries that didn't have this regulation, which effectively forces car makers to bring their most efficient vehicles into the country or otherwise pay a penalty. And so that will come into effect from next year. And hopefully off the back of that, we will start to see an even greater for those vehicles. But whilst that has been a great win, we cannot underestimate the significance of this change for consumers. There's a lot of people out there that are quite open to buying an electric vehicle. I'm in the fortunate position that our household's up to our 6th electric vehicle. So this is kind of, been tried and tested for us for many years. But for many people, they haven't even driven in an EV. It's a completely new thing. And a car outside of, being able to purchase a house is generally like the second most expensive asset that someone will buy. And so it's a big decision. And I think we have a lot of work to do in Australia in addressing some of the misinformation or misunderstandings that are out there about the technology so that people can be comfortable, confident, and ultimately when there are affordable options available to them, want to make that choice. We've definitely got some barriers there to be addressed.
Segues quite nicely to my next question. So speaking of barriers, what opportunities do you see, particularly around greater collaboration? Often these things need multiple different inputs from, say, like governments, private companies, academic institutions to all work together to make these things happen. What opportunities do you see in that collaboration to help advance decarbonisation and electrification in transport?
Yeah, so again, I've been very fortunate over the last few years to have that opportunity to work across government, academia. I am an academic at heart, and that's my background, but also now in the private sector. And so I think each of those different stakeholders have an important role to play, bringing a different perspective to the table and understanding that ultimately we have some targets that need to be achieved, and those targets, emission reduction targets, have to be achieved in what is a relatively short period of time. So we don't have any time to waste. We have to move forward. There are real constraints and challenges that affect private industry, and so getting that input to understand what those challenges are is critical, but it needs to always be set against what is the evidence of what needs to happen, and ultimately bringing that together for government to implement the policy necessary to enact that change. Because I'm confident that if we had 150 years, this change would naturally occur, but we do not have 150 years. Obviously our life expectancy is not that long, but from a societal perspective, we don't have 150 years to deliver this transition. We need to do it in a much shorter period of time, and that's where public policy and quite progressive public policy is necessary.
I definitely will come back to that achievability part in just a second, but I know you mentioned you have 2 jobs, but you kind of also have a third one on the side because you are part of the Institute of Transport and Logistics Studies Board of Advice at the University of Sydney, or ITLS for short. How did you get involved in the board, and what do you think makes that board of advice unique?
I've also been lucky to know David Hinscher at the ITLS for many years, and aspire to hopefully have even a fraction of the impact that he has had on our sector. And I guess probably now just under 2 years ago, David reached out and asked if I'd present to the Board of Advice to give them an update on the work that I was doing at that time as head of policy at the Electric Vehicle Council. And so I had a really great afternoon presenting to the board, and a great discussion coming out of that. And off the back of that, there were some further conversations and interest in if I would be able to become a member of the board. And for me, seeing not only the breadth of expertise for the individuals that sit on that board, but the depth of their knowledge in transport that was just an amazing option for me to be able to take on and have that ability now over a little bit more than a year to be able to network and provide that collective advice and then also learn from what ITLS is doing in this space. In addition to that, I'm fortunate to be an adjunct professor at ITLS and continue to work with the amazing team of professors and researchers that are doing groundbreaking research, trying to solve these big problems in the transport sector and beyond.
Back to that achievability question and also those big questions that we're trying to solve through ITLS. Do you think that sustainable transport systems are achievable in Australia before 2050? Because often that's the number that people pick. They've picked, I think, 2030, 2050. It seems to move. So what do you think about those kind of targets?
Yeah, look, at the end of the day, any number is almost arbitrary, and we've landed on 2050 as in some ways a neat number. I mean, jokes aside, in reality, we do know there's very strong evidence that somewhere in that period, mid-century, we need to get very close to net zero emissions across the entire economy in order to help avoid the potentially catastrophic impacts of climate change. By this point, some climate change impacts are unavoidable. That's just the reality. What we're now working towards is trying to avoid those absolutely catastrophic outcomes. And whilst it was very sobering for me, it became quite clear over the past 4 years when I had the chance to work as a lead author of the transport chapter for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, not only the important role that transport has to play, but how significant this challenge is right across the economy. And we all know that to some extent, but it's not until you have that chance to really dive in depth and come to handle all of the complexity around this to understand that this is something that, if we are able to pull it off, will be unprecedented in human history. This is a huge transition. So I remain optimistic that this is something that can be achieved. I think it's important that we continue to work towards that goal. But I am also sobered by the fact that this is something that we haven't demonstrated an ability to achieve before, and we certainly have a long, long way to go. And so that's a quite broad comment more broadly about decarbonisation. And when we think about transport in particular, the first comment there is that sometimes I find it quite frustrating that there's a lot of infighting across transport about, one, what is sustainable transport? And two, how do we get there? And I'm, again, I'm in this kind of interesting position where with one hat, I'm advocating for shared public and active transport. And I'm very pro, shift away from private vehicle adoption. But I'm also an advocate for electric vehicles because in my view, the cultural transition that's required to get everyone out of their cars into these alternative modes of transport will not occur by 2050. That is a much longer transition. I hope that it occurs this century, but I don't think that it's realistic to put all our eggs in that basket in order to hit the 2050 target. We need all the tools in the tool shed, and electrification of cars is a key lever within that. So I think as a sector, as an industry, we have a responsibility to take a bit of a step back and have a little less infighting over, this or that, and understand it's actually all of the above. We can't make this shift without electrifying transport. Equally, we can't make this shift and have a fully sustainable transport system if we don't start to seriously look at how to give people a legitimate option to move away from using a private car and have other alternatives that are affordable, accessible, and obviously sustainable.
The natural trend then in my questioning is what are some of the necessary steps you think that we need to take to achieve outcomes by 2030, 2050? You've mentioned reducing infighting. Are there any other ones that you think would be worthwhile highlighting?
Look, so I mean, and I don't want this to come across as if I'm prioritizing these. These are all happening in tandem, but clearly we are on this kind of cusp of electrifying transport. And in my view, it's not yet completely inevitable that it will happen in the right time frame, but we're very close to achieving that. And with a little bit more effort, we will be able to pull that off and have at least the electrification of light vehicles going in the right direction. When it comes to heavy vehicles like buses and trucks, we're quite a bit further behind. And that's not just, an artifact of the technology doesn't yet suit all applications, but it's more that we haven't had that focus on how to decarbonize that segment of transport. And I honestly think that, again, it is feasible before 2050 to have an almost zero, if not net zero, emission bus and truck sector. But we've got to have the targets and the policy in place to do that for Australia, and we're well away from that. So that's what we would call the improve part of avoid, shift, improve, that decarbonisation framework. And I think, again, we have all the right ingredients there, but a little bit more work to do to push that across the line. Where there hasn't been a strong focus to date, not so much in terms of research and other aspects, but at a government level, is how to give people those alternatives and encourage them to try shared public and active transport. And the federal government at the moment is developing a net zero transport plan and is out in consultation around that. And they do seem to now have, an increased focus on how to shift people. But I think it's still at too high a level because ultimately, in Odin Pass, when we're selling these subscriptions, we see a few things. The first is that the cost of some of these alternatives to private vehicles appear prohibitive, even though if we do the math, we can see that people would save money compared to driving. There's a perception that they're more expensive. And one of the things that I've been trying to kind of take on through the company is to offer subscriptions instead of paying for every trip, with the kind of basis behind that to flip the psychology. And instead of being penalized every time you choose to take an alternative mode, you've purchased an offering upfront, a subscription, and you want to maximize the utility of that. You want to get best bang for your buck. So you're going to then be, using as much of it as possible. The key is to set that subscription price at a level that people are willing to buy in. So that's one element, price. And I do think that there is a lot more potential in Australia for us to go in that direction. For too long, we've been focused on this idea of pay as you go. And I increasingly think the evidence is there to show that if you get the model right and the pricing right, people will convert over to subscriptions. And in fact, we've seen something like a 20 to 25% increase in public transport patronage, shifting from pay as you go to subscription-based pricing. So pretty significant there. But clearly, even if, we've got 50-cent fares up here in Queensland at the moment, and it's an important initiative. I'm always a supporter of doing things differently as trials to understand what happens. But I think even if you were to make public transport free, if it's not reliable, if it's not frequent, and it's not accessible, and it's not connected into other modes, there's a large segment of the population that simply just won't use it. I do have some concerns that we're not putting enough funding into that segment of transport to understand, to improve what is actually on offer. And until we do that, people will continue to opt for private vehicles. If we're completely exaggerating what's possible in that timeline, again, I think we could end up in a situation where we miss those targets, and that'd be a poor outcome for everyone.
I will say I am jealous of your 50-cent fares, but we also just got the Metro in Sydney. So I feel like we come out a little bit even. My last question is about learning more. So we've covered quite a lot of things, and I know you wear many hats because you've got Odin Pass, the Electric Vehicle Council, and ITLS, and all of your other academia associations as well. So if people wanted to learn more about any of the things you do, where might be the best place for them to go and do that?
Yeah, look, first and foremost, I highly recommend checking out the ITLS website. Regularly that's updated with groundbreaking research and also commentary on what's happening in transport, not just sustainable transport, but transport as a whole. So if you're interested in this space, that's a great starting point to learn more. Electric Vehicle Council, evc.org.au. We have some great information there for anyone that's wanting to understand what electric vehicles are, what needs to happen in terms of the transition, and also what it might mean for you as a consumer. And then finally, Odin Pass. We have a website, odinpass.com.au. We're relatively small. We are only operating up here in Southeast Queensland, but we have sold close to 70,000 subscriptions so far over the past 3 years. And we're seeing some really exciting outcomes from that. And whether it's our organisation or other organisations or even government around the country, I really hope that we're helping to shed some light on we can do things differently and it doesn't have to be at a massive cost.
Amazing. Well, Jake, thanks so much for your time and talking to me on the podcast today.
Glad to be with you, Emily. Thank you so much.
To learn more about any of the guests that we have on the Bite Size podcast, you can check out our show notes at compassiot.substack.com. Alternatively, if you'd like to know more about the company that runs this podcast, Compass IoT, you can visit our website, which is compassiot.com.au. Until next time.